The plainest, poorest, least regarded young woman to step down from a carriage at Carden Abbey that bright September afternoon was, in the sober truth of the matter, the wealthiest heiress in the whole of England, and not one of the fine people who watched her hand down her mistress's bandboxes and shawls had the faintest notion of it, which was precisely how she had arranged things, and precisely what she meant to keep hidden, until she had learned the one thing money had never once been able to buy her. Her name was Lady Rosanna Merefield, though for the length of this visit she had become, by her own careful design, plain Miss Ross, a paid companion of no fortune and no family worth the mention. In her true person she was 23, and sole heiress to the vast Merefield fortune, £100,000 and more, and estates in 4 counties, and she had spent every year since she left the schoolroom being hunted. That was the only honest word for it. From the moment the world understood the size of her inheritance, Rosanna had ceased to be a person and become a prize, and the drawing-rooms of London had filled season upon season with charming, attentive, beautifully mannered men who gazed into her eyes and spoke of her wit and her grace and her goodness of heart, and who would have gazed and spoken exactly so had she been squint-eyed and simple, because it was never her eyes they were courting. She had watched fortune-hunters bow over her hand until she could no longer tell flattery from feeling, and had come at last to a bleak and lonely certainty that she would never, so long as the world knew her name, be able to believe that any man alive wanted her for herself, and not for the golden weight of what she carried. It was her aunt, Lady Merefield, who had unwittingly shown her the way out of the trap. For Lady Merefield, in despair of her niece's endless refusals, had lately fixed upon what she declared to be the perfect solution, the Duke of Carden. "He is as rich as you are, my dear, richer perhaps," the aunt had said, "and so he cannot possibly be after your money, for what would he do with more of it? A man of his fortune is the one man in England who must take you for yourself. It is the safest match in the kingdom." And Rosanna had opened her mouth to refuse for the 100th time, and then had stopped, arrested by a thought. For she had heard a great deal of the Duke of Carden, and none of it soft. He was said to be proud and cold and impossible, a man of 31 who had turned away every matchmaking mamma in the 3 kingdoms, and who had lately made himself notorious by declaring, at a crowded dinner and quite without apology, that he would sooner die a bachelor than marry an heiress, that he was as sick of being valued for his rank and his rent roll as any woman ever was, that the whole mercenary marriage market was a thing he despised, and that he would take a wife only if he could find, somewhere in all the world, one honest creature who wanted the man and cared nothing for the Duke. It was thought very shocking. It was thought by the mammas very ungrateful. But Rosanna, reading of it in her aunt's excited letter, had felt something in her chest turn over, because it was, word for word, the very loneliness she had carried in secret for years, spoken aloud by a stranger. Here was a man caught in the identical trap, from the opposite side. Here was a man who wanted, as she wanted, to be loved for nothing but himself, and so she had made her wild, improper, entirely secret plan. She would not go to Carden Abbey as Lady Rosanna Merefield, the great heiress, to be inspected and courted and matched. She would go as Miss Ross, a nobody, her aunt's poor companion, for her aunt, once she grasped the scheme, had been persuaded to play along, chiefly because Lady Merefield could deny her niece nothing, and half believed the disguise would end in the desired marriage anyway. Rosanna would watch the proud, cold, impossible Duke from the shadows, unregarded, wanting nothing from him and offering nothing, and she would learn what manner of man he truly was when he believed there was no heiress in the room. And if he proved as hollow as all the rest, well, then she would go quietly away, and no one the wiser, and she would at least have kept her heart. But if he proved to be what his one reckless sentence had made her dare to hope, then she would have found the impossible thing, a man who had loved her first as a woman with nothing at all. She did not yet know what it would cost her to be nobody. She had never in her life been poor. She was about to learn in the space of a single week exactly how the world treats a woman it believes has nothing, and to discover that the lesson was the most valuable inheritance she had ever received. She learned it within the hour, and it took her breath away. Rosanna had known in a distant, comfortable way that the poor were slighted. Everyone knew that. She had given generously to the poor all her life and thought herself a woman of feeling. But she had never once stood inside the slighting and felt it land on her own skin, and it was a different thing entirely from the outside. As Miss Ross the companion, she was, she found, very nearly invisible. And where she was visible, she was an object, a convenience, a thing to fetch and carry and be spoken over as though she had no ears. The footmen who had bowed to Lady Rosanna Merefield now looked straight through Miss Ross. The great ladies who would have fought for the honor of the heiress's arm swept past the companion without a glance. She was given a small, cold room at the top of the house near the servants, and she was expected to be always at hand and never in the way, to hold shawls and windsilks, and carry messages and make herself small. And chief among those who taught her what it was to be nobody was a dazzling young beauty named Miss Lavinia Crewe. Miss Crewe was the reigning belle of the party, golden-haired and lovely and perfectly aware of it, and she had come to Carden Abbey with her sharp-eyed mother for one purpose only, to become the Duchess of Carden. That the Duke had sworn never to marry an heiress was, in Miss Crewe's mind, no obstacle but an opportunity, for the Crews had far more birth than fortune, and Lavinia had decided that a man who despised mercenary women would be all the more easily caught by a beautiful one who pretended to despise money too. She had, in short, a strategy, and a rival, even a penniless, invisible one, was not to be born. And so when Miss Crewe observed, as she observed everything that touched the Duke, that his Grace had once or twice let his cold eye rest a moment too long upon the quiet grey figure of the companion Miss Ross, she set herself to grinding that quiet figure into the dust. It was done with all the effortless art of a beautiful woman who has never been checked. Miss Crewe discovered 100 small errands for the companion, and invented 100 small failures. She spilled ratafia across Miss Ross's one good gown and laughed that the creature was so clumsy. She mimicked, for the amusement of the drawing-room, the companion's quiet country manners, her plain dress, her downcast eyes, and the other guests laughed too, easily, the way comfortable people laugh at those beneath them, and Rosanna stood among them, holding her mistress's shawl, and felt the laughter go over her like cold water. The small cruelties were, in a way, the least of it. What cut deeper, and taught her more, was the invisibility, the daily hourly experience of not existing. She stood for an hour behind her mistress's chair at dinner, and no one addressed a single word to her, though they spoke of her, over her, as one speaks of a dog or a piece of furniture. And she watched the very men who had knelt at Lady Rosanna Merefield's feet flirt and posture and shine, not 2 yards from her, without once suspecting that the wittiest and wealthiest woman they had ever pursued was standing among them in a grey gown, hearing every mercenary word. She learned what it was to be handed a plate last and coldest. She learned the particular loneliness of the top of a house, the servants' floor, where the fine world's laughter came up faintly through the boards long after her single candle was out. And she learned, most of all, the thing her whole cushioned life had hidden from her, that the warmth and deference and eager kindness she had taken all her days for the ordinary temperature of the world had never been the world at all. It had been the heat thrown off by her 100,000 pounds, and it did not belong to her, Rosanna, in the least, and never had. Strip the fortune away, and this, the snubs, the errands, the laughter, the cold plate, the invisibility, this was what remained. This was what the world was truly like. She had needed, she saw now, to feel it on her own skin to believe it. And having felt it, she understood at last, with a clarity that shamed her, exactly why a hunted man might build cold walls, and exactly what it would mean to find, in all this frozen country, one single person who was warm to you for no reason at all. Once, when Miss Ross had been sent to fetch a book and returned with the wrong one, Miss Crewe took it from her hands and let it drop deliberately to the floor and said, in a voice of sweet contempt that carried the length of the room, "One really cannot get decent service from these charity companions. They have neither wit nor breeding. It is kindness quite thrown away." And she had smiled and turned away, certain that a nobody would only bob her head and swallow it, as a nobody must. And Rosanna did swallow it. She bent and picked up the book, and said nothing, because she had chosen this, and would see it through. But something was happening to her, there on her knees on the fine carpet with the laughter ringing over her head, that no amount of her old comfortable charity had ever taught her. She was learning in her own bruised heart exactly what her wealth had always shielded her from, what the world was truly like underneath its bows and its flattery for those who had nothing to give it. She would never again, she understood, be quite the same woman who had stepped down from that carriage. And she found, kneeling there, that she was fiercely, unexpectedly glad of it. For a heiress who has learned in her own person what it is to be nobody is a very dangerous heiress indeed, and Miss Lavinia Crewe, laughing above her, had no notion at all of what she was making. She had come to Carden Abbey to answer one question: what manner of man was the Duke? And the answer, when it came, was not at all the cold, proud creature the world had promised her. She watched him as only an invisible woman can watch, from the edges of rooms over the top of her mistress's shawl, and what she saw first was not coldness, but siege. The Duke of Carden was a hunted man, and he knew it, and it had worn a hard shell over him the way weather wears stone. Everywhere he moved, the great house rearranged itself around him, the mammas steering their daughters into his path, the daughters brightening and posing, the ambitious men laughing too loudly at his smallest joke, the whole party bending toward him like flowers toward the sun, not for himself, but for what he was. Rosanna, who had lived her whole life inside that same suffocating attention, recognized it instantly, and recognized too the thing it does to a person, the way it teaches you to trust no smile, to weigh every kindness for its motive, to armor yourself in cold reserve simply to have 1 square inch of yourself that is not being courted. The world called the Duke proud. Rosanna, who had been called proud herself for the very same reason, knew it for what it truly was, a lonely man's last defense. And under the armor, when she watched closely, was a man she had not expected at all. He was unfailingly, quietly good to the people who could do nothing for him. She saw him spend half an hour in the stable yard with a nervous young groom, teaching the boy to gentle a skittish hunter, with a patience he never showed the fawning guests. She saw him slip away from his own grand dinner to sit a while with his old tutor, a poor half-blind clergyman he had invited to the party and seated, to the visible bafflement of the fashionable guests, in the place of honor. She heard from the servants' talk that flowed so freely around the invisible Miss Ross that the Duke knew every family on his lands by name, that no tenant went cold in winter, that the notorious cold Duke of Carden gave away in quiet charity more than most men spent on themselves and forbade a word of it to be spoken. There was one afternoon she carried with her ever after. A hard rain had come on suddenly while the party was out walking, and in the scramble back to the house, Rosanna, hurrying with her mistress's things, had come round the corner of the stable arch and stopped, unseen, at the sight of the Duke of Carden, soaked through, his fine coat forgotten, crouched in the mud beside the gatekeeper's small son, a boy of perhaps 5 who had fallen and cut his knee and was howling with the particular abandon of the very young. The great guests had swept past the child without a glance, as the great always do, but the Duke had stopped and got down into the wet, and Rosanna watched him gentle the little boy exactly as she had seen him gentle the skittish hunter, not hurrying him, not shaming the tears, but talking low and easy until the howls softened to sniffles, and then producing from his own pocket a sugared almond that a duke had, for reasons known only to himself, been carrying about, and tying up the cut knee with his own handkerchief of fine cambric that must have cost more than the gatekeeper earned in a month, and thinking nothing of it, and telling the boy he was a brave fellow, and sending him in to his mother, comforted. No one was meant to see it. He glanced up once, and Rosanna shrank back into the shadow of the arch, and he did not know he had been watched. And she stood in the rain with her heart turning over and thought, this is the man the world calls cold. This is the proud, impossible Duke of Carden. He is neither. He is only a good man who has been hunted so long that he has forgotten it is safe to be seen being good. And she understood, with a small cold shock of honesty, that she had come to this house half hoping to find him hollow so that she might keep her heart safe, and that it was already, quietly, far too late for that. He was not cold. He was guarded and weary and lonely and profoundly achingly honest in a world of flatterers. And Rosanna, watching him, felt her secret plan curdle into something far more perilous than she had bargained for, because she had come to inspect a stranger, and was beginning instead to understand him better than she had ever understood anyone. And then came the thing she had not dared to hope for. The Duke of Carden, hunted on every side by beautiful women who wanted to be his duchess, began, slowly, almost against his will, to seek out the company of the one woman in the house who wanted nothing from him at all. He found Miss Ross apart from the others, tending her mistress's fire or reading alone in a window seat, and he stopped and spoke to her. And because she was nobody, because she had nothing to gain and no game to play, she answered him plainly and even sparred with him, and did not brighten or pose or flatter. And Rosanna watched the guarded man discover, with something like wonder, that here at last was a person he need not suspect. He did not know that the plain companion was the greatest prize in England. He knew only that when he talked to Miss Ross for the first time in his hunted life, he could not tell that anyone was courting him, because as far as he could see, no one was. And Rosanna, who understood exactly what was happening because it was the mirror image of her own whole life, felt the ground shift dangerously beneath her careful plan. She had meant to observe him, weigh him, and decide. She had not meant to be drawn in herself. But there is nothing on earth so disarming to a person hunted for their worth as another person who wants nothing from them. And the two of them were each, without knowing the other's secret, precisely that gift to one another. Two starved people who had each, by pure accident, found the one companion in the room who was not trying to eat. It could not end well, she told herself in the cold of her attic room. Sooner or later she must reveal herself, and he would learn that the one honest woman who wanted nothing was in fact the very fortune he most dreaded, and everything true between them would be poisoned by the manner of its beginning. She knew this. She saw it coming the way one sees a storm stand up black along the hills. And still she went down each day to the quiet corners where he would be, because she could not, for the life of her, make herself stay away. It became a habit between them in the long golden days of that house party, though neither of them would have dared to call it that, the Duke and the companion finding each other in the quiet corners of the great house and talking as neither of them talked to anyone else alive. It began with sparring. The Duke, accustomed to being agreed with, found that Miss Ross would not agree with him, and it delighted him past all reason. She disputed his opinion of a book. She told him when he was lordly that he was being lordly. She declined with a grave and perfect courtesy to be impressed by him. And the Duke of Carden, who had not been unimpressed by anyone in years, kept coming back for more of it, the way a man dying of sweet things craves salt. They argued about poetry, and about whether the poor were better served by charity or by justice, and about the management of land, and Rosanna, who had run her own vast estates in all but name since she was 19, and knew more of drainage and rents and the price of wheat than any drawing-room miss was supposed to know, forgot herself again and again, and spoke as the mistress of Merefield, and not as the companion Miss Ross, and watched the Duke's dark brows go up in startled pleasure at a penniless girl who talked like a landowner. He asked her once how a companion came to know so much of rents and drainage and the price of wheat, and Rosanna, catching herself at the very edge of the cliff, had said only that she had kept house for a hard old relation who trusted no steward and made her do the accounts, which was near enough the truth to be told without a blush, for she had indeed learned estate management at the elbow of her own shrewd late father, and had run Merefield in all but name since. But she saw the Duke file the strangeness of her away behind his eyes, a small puzzle that did not fit, and she knew she must be careful. The trouble was that being careful grew harder by the day, for the more they talked, the less she wished to guard herself at all. There was a particular pleasure, sharp and new, in being listened to as a mind and not curtsied to as a fortune, in having a man dispute her opinion instead of flattering it, lean in to hear her argument instead of merely to be seen attending a great heiress. With the Duke of Carden, in those quiet, stolen half-hours, Rosanna was, for the first time in her adult life, simply a clever woman talking to a clever man, weighed by nothing but her own wit. And she understood that this exactly, and nothing grander, was the thing all her £100,000 had never once been able to purchase her, and that a plain grey gown had bought it in a week. She thought sometimes, watching his hard face ease into a real and unguarded laugh at something she had said, that she was the richest impostor in England, and had never in her life felt so honestly poor, nor so honestly happy. And that frightened her more than all Miss Crewe's malice, for she had come to test a stranger's heart, and was in a fair way to lose her own past recovering. And slowly the sparring deepened into something quieter and far more dangerous, which was honesty. One grey afternoon, when the rain had driven the party indoors, and the two of them had fallen into talk in the long library, the Duke said a thing Rosanna never forgot. He had been speaking with a bitterness he showed no one, of the marriage market, of the endless procession of women paraded before him, of the impossibility of ever knowing whether he was loved or merely wanted. And then he stopped, and looked at the quiet grey girl across the hearth, and said, "Forgive me. I do not know why I say such things to you. Only, you are the one person under this roof who does not seem to want anything of me, Miss Ross, and I find it is a very great relief. Do you know, I think you are the only honest conversation I have had in a 12-month. It is a strange thing to say to a lady I have known a week, but there it is." And Rosanna, whose whole heart was standing up in her chest, could not tell him the enormous truth, that she was not honest at all, that she was the very heiress he dreaded, that she had come in disguise to test him, and so she told him the only true thing she could. "I think, Your Grace," she said low, "that you and I are perhaps more alike than you know. I, too, have been valued for the wrong things all my life, until I hardly know whether I have any right things to be valued for at all. It is a lonely way to live. I did not think a duke could know anything of it." And the Duke looked at her for a long, long moment, with something opening in his hard-hunted face that she had not seen there before, and said quietly, "No, nor did I think a companion could." And into that silence, thick with a thing neither of them dared name, there came the sound of Miss Lavinia Crewe's voice in the doorway, and Rosanna looked up, and saw the beauty standing there with her lovely face gone white and sharp with fury, having seen and understood exactly what was happening between the Duke of Carden and the nobody in grey. Miss Lavinia Crewe was not a woman to lose a duke to a charity companion, and she moved against the threat with the cold speed of a snake. Rosanna learned the shape of it the way the powerless learn everything, by being invisible in a room where the powerful forget to guard their tongues. She was in the small anteroom off the music room late one evening, gathering her mistress's things, when Miss Crewe and her mother came in, low-voiced and quick, not troubling to lower their voices for a companion who did not signify, and Rosanna stood very still behind the half-open door and heard the whole of it. For Miss Crewe had determined upon a double stroke. The nobody Miss Ross must be got rid of, that first. Some small manufactured disgrace, a theft laid at her door, and the companion would be turned out of the house in the morning and never trouble Miss Crewe's designs again. "A brooch of mine will go missing," Miss Crewe was saying with a soft satisfaction that turned Rosanna's stomach, "and be found among the creature's things where I shall have put it. Who will doubt it? She is nobody. Nobody's steal. It is what everyone expects. She will be gone by noon in disgrace, and his grace may look for his honest little companion and find her a common thief." And then, with the field cleared, the second stroke, Miss Crewe would compromise the Duke into marriage. She would arrange to be discovered alone with him at night, in a situation from which no gentleman could honorably withdraw without offering for her, and the Duke of Carden, whatever his private feelings, was far too much the gentleman to ruin a lady's name by refusing. "He is nothing if not honorable," Miss Crewe said, with contempt for the very quality she meant to exploit. "His honor will do what my beauty could not. He will marry me to save my reputation, and be furious, and it will not matter in the least, for I shall be a duchess, and a duchess may be as disagreeable to her husband as she pleases." Rosanna stood in the dark behind the door with her hands pressed to her mouth, and understood, with a cold, clear fury, exactly the trap that was closing. A good and honest man to be snared through his own decency into a lifetime's misery, and an innocent woman to be branded a thief to clear the way, and both of it to be done within the day. And she, the invisible companion, Miss Ross, with no standing and no proof but her own overheard word, was the only soul in the house who knew. To speak was to be disbelieved, for who would take a charity companion's word against Miss Lavinia Crewe? To reveal herself as Lady Rosanna Merefield was to end the whole experiment of her heart, and to have to explain a month of deception to a man who prized honesty above everything on earth. And to do nothing was to watch 2 lives ruined by breakfast. There was no path through it that did not cost her something dear. She lay awake the whole of that night in her cold servant's room, turning it over and over, and the turning taught her something about herself she had not known before she came. The old Rosanna, the cushioned heiress of a month ago, would very likely have found some clever, cautious, comfortable way to protect herself first, to slip away and write an anonymous warning, and keep her own secret safe, and let the Duke look after his own affairs, for he was a grown man and a duke, and no concern of a companion's. But that Rosanna, she discovered, was gone, worn away somewhere between the cold plate and the dropped book, and the laughter over her bent head. In her place was a woman who had learned, on her own knees, exactly what it was to be helpless and slandered and disbelieved, and who found she could not, now for the safety of her own heart, stand by and watch it done to another, not to a good man snared through his own honor, and not even to the odious Miss Crewe were their places reversed. She had spent her whole life being one of the comfortable people who looked through others, and had simply never known it. Well, she knew it now. And knowing it, she found there was in truth no choice to make at all, only a price to pay, and somewhere in the gray before dawn, she stopped being afraid of the price. She lifted her chin, and she chose, as she had begun, this whole strange journey, by choosing to do the right thing, and let the cost of it fall where it would. She let Miss Crewe spring the first half of the trap because she had to, because a scheme half sprung is far easier to break than a scheme merely suspected. It came the next morning, as promised. In the crowded breakfast room before the assembled party, Miss Crewe discovered the loss of a diamond brooch, and wept prettily, and allowed her mother to suggest, so reluctantly, so kindly, that perhaps the servants' quarters should be searched, and the companion's room first of all, for one heard such things of these charity girls. And the housekeeper was sent and returned with the brooch wrapped in a handkerchief that everyone present could see had been taken from among Miss Ross's poor possessions, and a satisfied murmur went round the fine room, and every comfortable face turned to the pale grey companion with the ready contempt of people who have always known that nobodies are not to be trusted. Miss Crewe dabbed her eyes and said she was only grieved, so grieved, and the Duke of Carden stood at the window with his face gone hard and unreadable, and Rosanna felt the whole room close against her like a fist. It was a curious thing, she would think afterward, to stand in the center of that ring of comfortable contempt and feel almost calm. A month ago it would have destroyed her. A week ago even it might have. But she had spent that week learning precisely how little the good opinion of such people was worth, and precisely how quick they were to believe the worst of anyone who could not repay them for believing better. And so their scorn, when it came, found her armored in a way she had not been before. She looked round the room slowly, at the mother who had schooled her daughter in this, at the guests already whispering, at the housekeeper standing unhappy with the brooch in her hand. For the housekeeper at least had liked the quiet companion and plainly did not enjoy her office. And last of all, at the Duke, whose hard, unreadable face was the only thing in the room she could not bear. For she saw that he was fighting himself, that some part of him wanted, against all sense, to defend the penniless companion he had no earthly reason to trust, and that his cold caution, the hunted man's hard-won distrust of everyone, was warring against it and winning, and that in another moment he would say nothing, and let her be condemned and hate himself for it after. and Rosanna understood that she could wait no longer for a rescue that honor would not let him give a nobody, that if the truth was to be told in that room she must tell it herself, and pay, all at once, the whole price she had been putting off for a week. And then Miss Ross the companion lifted her head and stood up straight and spoke, not in the low, flat voice of a nobody, but in the clear, cool, educated voice of a great lady, a voice that turned every head in the room. "I did not take the brooch," she said. "Miss Crewe placed it among my things herself. I know this because I overheard her plan it, last evening, in the anteroom off the music room, the theft, to be rid of me, and the second scheme after it, to compromise his grace into a marriage he does not want, by contriving to be discovered alone with him tonight. I have no proof but my word. But my word, as it happens, is rather better than you suppose." She reached up and drew off the plain cap that had helped to hide her, and something in her bearing changed entirely, so that the fashionable people who had looked through her for a week suddenly could not look away. "I am not Miss Ross. There is no Miss Ross. My name is Lady Rosanna Merefield. Some of you have hunted me across 3 seasons for my £100,000. I came to this house in a grey gown and a false name because I wished, for once in my life, to be treated as a woman and not as a fortune. And I have learned a very great deal by it, more than any of you would wish me to know." She turned her clear grey eyes on the whitening face of Miss Lavinia Crewe. "I know exactly what the world does to a woman it believes has nothing. I have felt it this week on my own skin, and I will not stand by and let it be done by a lie to clear a schemer's path to an honest man." The breakfast room had gone utterly, ringingly silent. Lady Merefield at the far end was heard to make a small sound of complicated relief, and the Duke of Carden turned from the window and looked at the plain grey companion who had just declared herself the greatest heiress in England, the very creature he had sworn before all the world that he would never marry, with an expression that Rosanna could not read at all, and that frightened her more than all Miss Crewe's malice. Miss Lavinia Crewe and her mother left Carden Abbey within the hour, in a closed carriage and a cloud of ruin, for a woman exposed before all society as a thief by proxy and a marriage trapper is not received anywhere for a very long time, and no protest availed them. The overheard plot, the planted brooch, the whole ugly design lay too plainly in the open, and half the room had seen the handkerchief. Lady Merefield, once she had recovered from the shock of her niece unmasking herself over the breakfast things, threw herself into the business of the departure with the energy of a woman who scents a wedding, and the other guests, sensing which way the wind had turned, discovered all at once that they had never much liked Miss Crewe, and had always thought there was something remarkable about the quiet companion. But Rosanna took no joy in any of it, for her eyes were on the Duke, and the Duke had said not one single word to her since she had drawn off her cap, and his silence was the loudest thing in the house. She had known, of course, that the reckoning must come. She had simply not let herself imagine how it would feel. All week she had told herself that if the Duke proved true, then the manner of her testing him would not matter, that a good man would understand. But now, watching him move through the wreck of the morning grave, enclosed and remote, not once meeting her eyes, she saw how much she had left out of her reckoning. She had thought a great deal about his heart and almost nothing about his pride. And the Duke of Carden was a proud man, and a private one, and she had drawn out the most guarded confidences of that private heart under a name that was a lie, and then revealed before a roomful of gossips that she had been the one thing in the world he had sworn to avoid, watching him all the while. She had proved him true. She had also, she understood now with a sinking heart, made a fool of him, gently and for the best of reasons, but made a fool of him nonetheless, in his own house, before the very world whose opinion had hunted him half to madness. And she did not know, as she waited through that long silent day for him to seek her out, whether the love she had seen in him would prove larger than the pride she had wounded, or whether she had won her long gamble only to lose it at the very last, on a thing she had never thought to weigh. He came to her at last in the library, in the grey of the late afternoon, where she had gone to be alone with the wreckage of her own heart. And his face, when he came, was not the hunted man's guarded armor, but something rawer and angrier and far more wounded. "You are the heiress," he said without preamble. Lady Rosanna Merefield, £100,000. The very thing I said before the whole of London, that I would never in my life marry." He walked away and turned, and there was a terrible, controlled hurt in his voice. "Do you know what you have done? For a week I have talked to you as I have talked to no one in years. I told you the most private bitterness of my heart, that I could never know whether I was wanted for myself or for my rank. And all the while you knew. You knew exactly, because you were the one person in England in the same trap, and you said nothing. You let me believe you were a nobody who wanted nothing of me, and it was that, God help me, that very belief, that let me—" He stopped himself, jaw tight. "You tested me, like a specimen. You came into my house in disguise and set a trap of your own, however gentler than Miss Crewe's, and you watched me blunder into it. Was it amusing, my lady, to see the proud cold Duke of Carden, who swore he'd never be caught, fall like any fool for a plain grey gown? Have I passed your examination?" And Rosanna, who had braced for his contempt but not for his hurt, felt the tears stand in her eyes, and did not let them fall, and gave him the truth, which was all she had left. "You have every right to be angry," she said steadily. "I did deceive you, and I am more sorry for the manner of it than I can say. But hear me, and then think what you will. I did not come to test you as a specimen. I came because I read one sentence you had spoken, that you would marry only a woman who wanted the man and cared nothing for the Duke, and I recognized it, word for word, as the loneliness I had carried in secret for years, and I dared for the first time in my life to hope that somewhere there was a person who understood. I did not deceive you to trap you. Gabriel, I deceived you because it was the only way on earth I could ever have known whether you might love me before you knew what I was worth. And I would do it again, though I would do it more gently if I knew how. And I have my answer now, and it is worth more to me than the whole £100,000, for you did love the woman in the grey gown, the woman with nothing. I saw it, and you cannot unsay it. You are the only man alive who ever wanted me before he wanted my fortune. Be angry if you must. But do not tell me it was not real. We both know that it was." The Duke of Carden stood very still in the grey library light, and Rosanna watched the war in him, the wounded pride that wanted to send her away, and be proved right in his cold armor, against the plain, undeniable fact of a week's true happiness, that he could not, however he tried, pretend away. For a long moment she thought she had lost. He stood with his jaw set and his eyes hard, and every line of him was the proud, remote Duke the world had described, the man who armored himself against being made a fool, and she saw him reach for that armor now as a drowning man reaches for a spar. It would have been the easier thing, and the safer, to seize it, to be coldly, unanswerably in the right, to send the deceiving heiress away and keep his wounded dignity intact, and his heart shut fast as it had been for years. She waited for him to do it. She found no argument left to offer that she had not already offered. She had told him the whole truth of her heart and could do no more. And so she simply stood and let him see her and waited. And slowly, as she watched, the anger went out of him and left behind it something bare and young and disbelieving. "You read that sentence," he said, "and you understood it." It was not quite a question. In all the world, Rosanna, there is precisely one other person who could have understood that sentence from the inside. One other soul caught in the identical trap, valued for everything but themselves. I said it into a crowded room, half in despair, certain no one would ever truly hear it. And you did. You are the only creature living who ever could have. He passed a hand over his face and gave a short, shaken, wondering laugh. "I have been so afraid for so long of being wanted for the wrong reasons, that I never once considered the far stranger terror of being understood for the right ones. You have done to me exactly what I swore no one would ever manage, and the maddening, impossible truth of it is that I cannot even be properly angry, because you did it by being the one honest thing in a house full of liars, and by suffering a week of contempt on your knees to do it, and by loving me, apparently, before you had the smallest reason to." He crossed the room to her, this proud, hunted man, and stopped close. and looked down at her with his whole guarded heart at last standing open in his eyes.
I told the world I would never marry an heiress. I find I must now go and tell the world that I was a fool, and that I mean to marry the only woman who ever loved me for myself, who happens, by the purest inconvenience, to be the richest woman in England. Will you have me, Rosanna? Not the Duke. Me.
The man you argued with in the library, who has nothing you could possibly want, and who has been more alive this one strange week than in all his hunted life before it. I have been trying to give away my whole fortune for years,
said Rosanna, half laughing, half weeping, to find a man who would take only me. I begin to think I have finally managed it. And she put her hand in his. They were married before the year was out, and it was much remarked in the drawing-rooms that had hunted them both, how the coldest duke and the most elusive heiress in England had somehow, against all the mercenary odds, made the one love match of the season. Though only the two of them ever knew that they had found each other in the single week when one of them had nothing, and had been given, by that strange grace, the one gift neither rank nor fortune could ever buy, to be chosen for nothing but themselves. And Carden Abbey, which had seen so much cold courting and so many baited traps, saw at last two people who had each, in their separate loneliness, given up on ever being truly known, and who had found in each other the one door that opened. As for the great fortune that had made a prisoner of her and a target of him, they gave the most of it away, in the end, to schools and to widows and to the tenants of 4 counties, keeping only what 2 contented people could want, for they had each spent a lonely lifetime being valued for that gold, and took a quiet joy ever after in spending it on everyone but themselves. On the first night of their marriage, the Duke of Carden gave his wife not diamonds. She had diamonds enough to sink a ship, but a small worn thing he drew from his breast, a plain grey cap, the very one she had worn as Miss Ross and drawn off before the astonished room. He had kept it, he confessed, from the moment it fell. He gave it back into her hands and told her it was the most precious thing he owned, for it was the disguise that had let a hunted man forget, for one blessed week, that he was a prize and be instead simply a man, falling in love with a woman who wanted nothing of him but himself. And then he took her hand and led her in, and the great house that had been so full of schemes and masks kept for once no secret at all, and left its 2 happiest prisoners free. If this story warmed you even half so much as that library fire warmed a heart that had given up hoping, then stay a moment longer with me. Tap the like, so more good souls find their way to this quiet corner where the overlooked are seen at last, and the true of heart are chosen. And subscribe, and stay close, for there is another great house and another hidden name waiting for the next time we sit together by the fire. Until then, be kind to the ones who can do nothing for you. You never truly know, my dear, who is wearing the grey gown.